I've always had an interesting relationship with women's wrestling. Watching when I was younger, I always enjoyed people like Mickie James, Beth Phoenix, and Melina for their wrestling in an era where they were transitioning from pure sex appeal to their weird variety show act. I watched TNA as Gail Kim left and Taylor Wilde debuted and thought, hell yeah, women's wrestling kicks ass. I stopped watching for a few years, and when I came back, I instantly fell for wrestlers like Bayley and Becky Lynch before jetting off to New Japan, which had a strict no girls allowed policy that I staunchly advocated to continue because I didn't trust New Japan to book women properly. On the rare occasions that I tapped back into WWE, I often did it solely to watch women, watching Ronda Rousey's first run and the Evolution pay-per-view in 2018. When I started watching Ring of Honor, from the moment she debuted, Roxy became one of my favorites, along with Miranda Alizé, Trish Adora, and Holodead. During my hiatus from watching wrestling, I would occasionally peek into what was happening and see Bianca Belair doing freak shit that ain't nobody ever did before. And now that I've returned to watching WWE, I've come to the realization that I should have understood all along. Women are the only good wrestlers, and it's been that way forever. I don't know what it is that sets women apart from men in wrestling that tickles my brain in such a definable way, but whatever it is, it's clearly a defining feature of my wrestling fandom. So I know that if I was running a company, I would run the book 50-50. However much time men get, women get. If there's a world championship, I would not call it the world championship for the men and the women's world championship for the women. It would either be the world championship for both, or it would be the men's world championship and the women's world championship. In my perfect world, these things would already exist. But unfortunately, this world is not the one that we live in. The world we live in is harsh and strange when it comes to women. Generally, of course, generally. But in wrestling, the showcasing of women has two arms. You have the women's only companies. Primarily these are in Japan, but there are a smattering everywhere there is wrestling to be found. And then there's women's divisions in the larger companies. WWE has women signed and has women's matches. TNA has women signed and has women's matches. AEW has women signed. The dynamic in the latter has created a strange culture when it comes to women's wrestling fandom that I want to discuss. But before I go any further, I want to head off weirdos out there on both sides of this subject. While I might make digs at some companies here and there, WWE has women signed and has women's matches. TNA has women signed and has women's matches. AEW has women signed. It's important to recognize that this subsect of culture, as have all subcultures within the larger culture of Western wrestling fandom, has largely been directed by the actions of the World Wrestling Entertainment. I'm not going to spend eons harping on about how WWE are evil or how women's wrestling was handicapped by a cabal of sex predators because while that's true, very few other companies actually picked up the torch because they were also being run by sex pervert men. So while the culture around women's wrestling has largely been a WWE-led problem, the source of the problem is not WWE. It's misogyny. So to weird WWE fans who will get mad that I'm saying this, you don't get to be a fan of the cultural monolith and also pretend like they don't create negative culture. And to the weird, anti-WWE fans who will get mad that I'm absolving WWE of blame or whatever, while this is a WWE-led problem, and the people who ran the WWE were sex criminals and that might speak to how they utilized women, you are not better than shitting on them only and ignoring that there has always been a problem with the portrayal in women in wrestling. Because the root of that problem with portrayal is a lot deeper than this shitty hobby. Alright, cool. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about diva stans. So if you've not been online, the term diva stan comes from this weird sect of people on X, the everything app. These people consume wrestling largely through the lens of, I'm not really sure, reality show and music fandom, I think. So they are mostly consumed with women and how they look and how much cunt they serve and end up hyperfixating on the diva era of wrestling because it was when women were the most fashionable. These people confound me because I've never been able to section off my brain and consume one part of something and convince myself that that is what's good and only consume that. Ultimately, this problem with perception is what ran me into problems with New Japan fans who just wanted to watch matches or liked how hot the boys were. When I watch something, I need to watch all of it, and I need the actual portrayal of all of it to be good, or else I'm mad about it. I can't just find joy in one or two parts of something. So in that way, I'm actually envious of diva stans who have formed communities over Carmella moonwalking and will dox people who say that Liv Morgan's jean shorts aren't praxis. Now, there are a lot of people out there who think that diva stans are terrorists. But no matter what you think about them, I think that it's interesting to ponder why diva stans exist and what they might actually tell us about fandom in general, and why women's wrestling is such a strange thing. The portrayal of women's wrestling in mixed companies has always been a strange thing. There has obviously always been a spectrum in portrayal. AEW notably has featured women in a way where they're kind of saying, "Here, damn," because you kind of have to, or else you'll be called sexist. WWE has been both evil and also the company to portray women the best, so I don't know. TNA has portrayed women probably the best consistently, and that they were in their own divisions with stories and characters. But I think that the best way to show why this is such an odd idea is demonstrated with a graph. Let's say that a wrestling company like TNA portrays all of their divisions equally. They have the world title, the X Division title, the tag team titles, and the women's title. I know that they have more than this, but let's just say they have these 4 very specific stock divisions. Now, if you're portraying all of these completely equally, logic would dictate that each of these divisions get 25% of the time on the show. But that doesn't really work out because 3 of these segments are men's divisions, with 1 being the women's division. So even with the best laid plan for portrayal, one with equal focus on the 4 basic divisions of modern wrestling, women, at best, are able to claim 25% of the time. If we were to tweak this to being more realistic, we can add a miscellaneous section where non-title feuds and different segments can exist. Let's be generous and say these take up 10% of the time. Now, let's say that we have the World, X, and Tag divisions having title-related stories and matches that are not strictly for the titles, but are leading to title matches. So let's expand these divisions by 5%. Let's be extremely generous and say that women are also getting this treatment, and we expand their portrayal 5%. Now, suddenly, we have 120% of time, plus the 10% of miscellaneous. Time has to be cut somewhere. And if we are all being $100, the first place they will look to cut time is for women. This isn't a specific TNA thing. I just use them as an example because they're the ones who are most likely to portray women equally. Women generally get less time than the men, and when things need to be cut, let's say you cut 3 things from men and 3 things from women to keep it fair and balanced, you always end up omitting that men are getting 3 things cut from a pool of, say, 20 things, while women are having 3 things cut from a pool of about 5 things. Historically, this is how women's wrestling has been portrayed, and it's created a fan base that has very specific desires. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to this. Women's wrestling in the WWE has undergone a major retooling over the course of 15 years or so. They were wrestling kind of, and then they weren't, and then they were sex dolls or something, and then they were wrestling again, and then they were just kind of there, then they were wrestling, and then some bigger stars started popping up, and they got bigger spots, and then they kind of just became part of the show in a more significant capacity. All things considered, 15 years is strangely extremely long and not that long of time. Someone who was 10 in 2009 would be 25 today, and their experience with viewing women's wrestling would have undergone dramatic shifts in their conscious life. So imagine you're older and more calloused, and you understand women to be a sideshow, and you see them slowly become more and more significant parts of the show. So you end up feeling like you're being left behind. First off, good, fuck you. But also, we can't act confused why that guy is upset that women are no longer sex dolls, because they were not that long ago. Women's wrestling and its evolution into a more prominent fixture in the sport came from different avenues like reality shows and parasocial relationships online and accidents. And when it was largely a very small segment of the show, this created a fan environment that had to recondition the way it viewed women's wrestling. There are fewer women's wrestlers and even fewer spots for women's wrestling on TV. So when they do get showcased, women need to be distinct visually, they need to have a clear and communicable gimmick, and outside of any one individual, there is an expectation that as many women need to be showcased as possible. This one specific desire is two-pronged. I think part of it are diva stans who got into wrestling during an era where WWE said, all right, here damn, with regards to women. So they would have a 3-minute, 10-woman tag match to get as many of them on TV as possible. But I also think it's because if you focused on 2 wrestlers in a feud for a month with a segment on each show, that is potentially 50 to 100% of all of the portrayal of women because of how many fewer spaces they get compared to men. Add in a spice of women's wrestling fans being fixated on their faves, and you get a really strange dynamic of how people want companies to showcase women, and nobody really knows how to go about it besides apparently Shawn Michaels in NXT. All of this filters down to the dynamic that exists within the modern-day titan of women's wrestling, Rhea Bloody Ripley. Rhea Ripley is an insane wrestler in just about every way imaginable. I think it's rare for a wrestler to get so much better after so many years as a top performer. I thought Rhea was incredibly normal as a wrestler the first 20 times I saw her, and then when I tapped back into WWE and I saw her, she's just the most reckless and dynamic wrestler in such small ways that I both admire and fear for her. Technically, Rhea Ripley is the second, but in my opinion, Rhea Ripley is the first women's wrestling star in WWE to break through the way that they portray top women's wrestlers and just be portrayed the way a top wrestler has always been portrayed. They win their promo battles, they win their fights. If they lose their fights, it's because they got attacked by multiple people. They win their matches, and if they don't, they get screwed. Largely speaking, this is how top wrestlers are portrayed everywhere. I'd actually argue that Rhea hasn't been portrayed strong enough for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute, but here's the problem. WWE doesn't actually know how to portray women as dominant stars without showing them, and I wish I had better words for this, cucking men. This also happened with Becky Lynch. During her The Man run, she shit on Edge and his silly neck and rejected a handshake from John Cena, and it only made her a bigger star. But Rhea Ripley's entire gimmick was like stepping on men. She cucked Dom into symptom, she would stand eye to eye with the Judgment Day opponents, and largely do anything except wrestle other top wrestlers. But the thing is that this fucking works. It sucks that it works, but it does work. The reason Rhea Ripley is such a weird figure for me is because while this undoubtedly works, I don't think I like the place that it comes from. It just feels like there is an understanding between the WWE and their audience that women are lesser than men, but this woman is so strong that she could fight the men, which just reinforces how strong women are in relation to men. I think that wrestling has largely not earned this dynamic's existence, not being under a bit of scrutiny. I felt this way when Toni Storm, Mariah May, and Mina Shirakawa had a gimmick where they were all kissing or something, and people defended it by saying that it was popping the crowd and the women's idea. But wrestling in their weird culture with sexualizing women still hasn't reconciled that enough for me to feel comfortable playing it for laughs. That said, this scrutiny does not appear to be the source of any frustration with Rhea Ripley. The source seems to be, again, two-pronged. There is the psychotic side, the fans of Liv Morgan who are upset that Rhea Ripley is booked prominently, and Liv Morgan is a heel, so that means she's getting bitched out and running away afraid of Rhea Ripley and her girth for months. And then there's people who are closer to what I'm talking about. If Raw has 15 segments, I don't know if that's true, that just feels vaguely true, and there are 5 dedicated to women, let's say 2 matches and 3 promos, and 3 of these segments feature Rhea Ripley, not unrealistic, that is 60% of the time that women would have on Raw dedicated to one person. And if women are already getting 33% of the time on a show, dedicating 60% of that 33% to one woman means that you have next to no time to showcase anyone else. Theoretically, yes, I agree this is a problem, but it's a problem that is both solved and made more complicated by itself. Rhea Ripley is a big star, so in theory, her star power will rise tides and also create space for women, as that is who she actually has to wrestle. You theoretically need big figures like Ronda Rousey and Becky Lynch to push women further, and I kind of agree. But where it gets complicated is that wrestling actually doesn't work like that. The biggest pro and con of Rhea Ripley and her time at the top of women's wrestling is that she has been so effing good that she doesn't require help from anybody. When Rhea won the title from Charlotte Flair, these were the women she faced for the title: Zelina Vega, Natalya, Raquel Rodriguez, Zori Stork, Ivy Nile, Nia Jax, Becky Lynch. That's a fine little list. You got some really good wrestlers in there. At the same time, over on SmackDown, Bianca Belair, Asuka, Io Sky, and Bayley are wrestling. There is a dramatic difference in star power between who is wrestling on SmackDown and the women who are wrestling Rhea Ripley for the title on Raw. But that's the thing about wrestling. If you're big enough, you don't need to beat Bianca, Asuka, Io, and Bayley in a row to be viewed as a big star. You could skate by wrestling Raquel Rodriguez and Ivy Nile. Ultimately, this hurts the division, but it helps Rhea Ripley because there is no one there to pull the shine off of her, and that's something that I could argue should not be happening, as she is a 28-year-old megastar in the prime of her career. I think that wrestling is always catered to the megastars and does not give a single goddamn about the mid-card. You need a mid-card to fill out a show, you need a mid-card to hawk t-shirts or whatever, you need a mid-card in case the megastars call in sick. But if the WWE could have jettisoned half the company into space to make sure John Cena was happy, they would have done it, and they probably would have been right to. Professionally, if not morally. I think that people fixate on front-facing figures too much. People will see teachers protesting outside of a school and say, wow, they sure are complaining an awful lot, because that's who they can see. And the people who are fucking them out of fair compensation and support are invisible, so they receive next to no scrutiny. Rhea Ripley and her booking is focused upon as a problem because she dominates screen time and perception. But really, she is a demonstration of how far women's wrestling has come. She is being booked like every top wrestler of every company that has ever been since the beginning of time. Your real problems don't come from Rhea Ripley. They come from bookers and executives who cut time for women's wrestling, and with the fans who don't show up for women's wrestling that communicates to the bookers and executives that there is no monetary gain for doing it. As far as WWE has come, women's wrestling is still very much a side event, exhibited by the fact that you will rarely say male wrestling like you would women's wrestling. Rhea Ripley is not the solution to rally around because salvation and change doesn't come by rallying around one figure. It comes from demanding change forever and not taking a bone when it's thrown to you. If you actually care about making a change, stop worrying about Liv Morgan not being portrayed strong enough versus literal top star Rhea Ripley, and start worrying about why Lyra Valkyria can disappear from TV for 4 months, or why Bayley has no stories as champion.